Hello YouTube. Today I'm going to be taking a look at a new to me Kodak 35 RF. These were built in the late 40s, very early 50s, and they were the ones, they were an updated version of the Model 35, and they had the metal cyborg attachment right on the side here. I'm not actually going to go into the process of disassembling this thing. There's a website which I will put in the show notes below that gives an excellent written description of how to take the top off and the rangefinder and the works for the shutter apart with pictures. So I'm going to skip all that. My thing today is, when I bought this, and I didn't pay very much for it, the shutter was stuck, as they frequently are on these cameras, and I got it to this point. I started disassembling it, which is very easy, I thought. I got it to this point, and before I took all of this stuff apart, it actually comes apart in two pieces. You undo some screws, this thing lifts off, then there's all the works down inside there, and the leaves for both your iris and your shutter. I wanted to try cleaning this thing up before I actually took it all apart, because I'm really not all that thrilled about all those tiny little parts being disassembled and having to realign everything. I've done it, but if I can avoid it, I will. So what I did is I did the same thing I'd done in the past. I took my 99% isopropyl alcohol, an eyedropper, and quite literally filled up the eyedropper, dropped it into all the open spaces on the shutter leaves, and worked the shutter. And you do that. Once you get all the stuff apart, you can take the red indicator, gently pull it over, hit the lever, and nothing happens. So then you try it again. You push this back up where it belongs, and then it opens, and it works weird without this ring on. You have to hit it a second time and it'll close. So I got it good and drippy wet, and I just worked the shutter a few times, and then I would take my compressed air and blow all the liquid alcohol. This 99% stuff evaporates and dries very quickly, so it's awesome to work with. And that is pretty much all I did to this thing. It worked the first time when I soaked it with alcohol and blew it out. I did it 2 more times after that, just to get as much of the crud out as I possibly could. A couple things you want to be aware of. I hadn't actually planned on having this ring off. Just last night I had got this ring back on here. Excuse me. And while it's not difficult, it is a nuisance, because there's 3 or 4 different things you've got to get all lined up in here to work right. You've got to have this is your tab for the shutter speeds. The clockworks are in there. I don't actually know what some of these things do. I just know that if they're in the wrong position, the thing's not going to work right. This has to be in the right position. And let's see if I can very quickly stick it back on there. And you got these 2 things right over here. And you'll feel the thing settle itself down. So hopefully, if I got it right, it worked. This here, according to what I read, is for a timed exposure, or your shutter timer if you want to take a self-portrait. I haven't actually been able to make it work, but I would chalk that up to simply not really knowing how to use it. When I got it all cleaned out to my own satisfaction, I put this ring on. I made sure that this was in place. I made sure these 2 little tabby things here were in place. I made sure this thing was right, and this ring here has to be flat And again, resolution is an issue here. This right here, one of the problems I kept having was this ring would pop up, and this arm, which is your shutter release arm, would drop in behind this ring, and you'll see it once it's apart. It's part of this thing right here. I don't know if you can see it move a little bit. See, there, I just knocked it out of place right then. This is not actually a video intended for any particular instruction other than how to clean this thing up a little bit, rather than go to the trouble of disassembling that whole shutter assembly. And when I got it cleaned out, I got it working, it works very well. I did take my synthetic watch oil and I did put a dot on this pivot point here. There's a point right there, and you'll see it wiggle when you work the shutter release. And there was another spot, I don't remember where it was. It was somewhere in here. It was an obvious moving point that I could touch with oil without contaminating the leaves of the shutter. I've taken these shutters apart before, and while it's doable and it's not terribly complicated, it is time consuming because if you're like me, you're gonna have to do it 4 or 5, 6 times, because you'll be one tiny part away from being done, and you'll sneeze or you'll bump the table or something, and you'll have to start all over again. So I would recommend, if you do get to that point where you have to take the leaves apart, reassemble all this stuff dry. Don't oil things and especially don't oil the shutter. I know some websites recommend, you know, a little bit of oil here and there on the shutter leaves. Anytime I've done those, which is rarely, anytime I've done them, I have set them dry and left them dry, and they work fine. When I do reassemble this, which hopefully will be fairly soon, again, you gotta set this ring back on here. You gotta make sure that it's sitting down there properly, and you'll feel it. It'll feel like it's riding smoothly. You'll see that these 2 tabs here will rise and fall on. There's a little not an indentation, but a bump in. There's a series of humps and grooves, like the edge of a key on the inside of this ring. You'll see them work. So you want to make sure before you do your final assembly, before you screw this ring down here, you want to make sure all that stuff is set properly. Then comes this ring, and this is kind of neat because it has a locator pin. I don't know if you can see that hole at the top. It has a locator hole. It sets on a pin like that, so you can't screw up the alignment. And I've marked all my stuff with a permanent marker, and to get that off, you steal your wife's nail polish remover, and the acetone will take that right off. And that, I think, is pretty much all I wanted to show you. As I said, eyedropper, I wasn't shy about it. I flooded the thing. When I did it, I held it up this way because I didn't want it to run into the body of the camera. I wanted it, hopefully, to run out some little slot in the bottom. Some of it did, some of it didn't. Blew it dry, and it worked on the first try. I'm not guaranteeing results, of course, and always remember that this is a great way to destroy your camera. And just for a quick look here, this is the top of the camera. I've removed the coupler, the rangefinder coupler arm here. My mirrors actually fell out, so I've got to glue those back in. But otherwise, I think I covered everything that I wanted to cover. I'm going to check my cheat sheet here, make sure I... Yeah. That's all I wanted to show you. It's a good option to try if your camera's screwed up anyhow. It's worth trying, because maybe you'll get lucky, as I did with this one, and it'll just loosen up. You can clean it out with alcohol and compressed